Welcome. My name is Dr. Michael Linville. I'm an associate professor in the United States where I teach full-time in a PhD program in organizational leadership. Thank you for taking the time to view my presentation. In the past decade, we've seen the rapid rise of the global economy that has resulted in dramatic differences in how we trade, how we conduct business. Add to that the monumental shift of the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic, and we're left with a world that in many respects we hardly recognize. Many of the things that we used to consider normal, especially in the workplace, no longer exist. Each of these phenomena represent adaptation challenges for us as individuals, but the implications for leaders are far more profound. Due to the effects of globalization, senior executives have launched initiatives to develop global leaders. However, the success of programs like that have been mixed at best. In the rapidly evolving global economy, organizations necessarily are relying upon a geographically displaced workforce, dispersed, I should say. Teams in many cases must be built with and staffed by the best available experts, regardless of where they may be located. Successful global organizations benefit from this international diversity in the different experiences and expertise that such a global workforce provides. This all begins with an understanding of leadership. Many definitions of leadership exist. Here is one very simple one. James McGregor Burns once wrote that leadership is the influential relationship between leaders and followers who share knowledge, motives, goals, and values. As simple as that may seem, however, the phenomenon of leadership is quite complex, largely because it is multidisciplinary. For example, leadership draws upon a long list of other disciplines like psychology, sociology, history, philosophy, business, and many others. Leadership also is complex because it involves people, and people are complicated. Some of the largest organizations in the world have attempted to create comprehensive lists of all the skills and attributes needed for a person to be considered a highly effective leader. I've seen a couple of those lists reach a total of 250 different competencies. Imagine trying to find someone who could live up to such a list. This slide lists only a very few of the skills that many of us expect our leaders to possess. Is it any wonder why finding great leaders is so difficult? In the past, however, we've tended to identify these competencies without giving much thought to assumptions about cultural contexts, especially if we're leading within an organization that largely operates within our own national borders or is fairly homogeneous culturally. It's no secret that the world is shrinking. By that, of course, I mean that distances between geographical locations and cultures have been greatly reduced through ease of travel, dramatically enhanced technology, political trade agreements, and other reasons. Increasing numbers of us are now working on teams that are widely distributed around the world and connected by technology, such as this conference. Such teams benefit from a variety of viewpoints, but they can face cultural, psychological, and practical pitfalls that are less of a factor when collaborators mostly represent a single or similar culture. Obstacles also present themselves because no longer are we all in one room together physically. Allow me to share just one practical example of how this is relevant in our world today. One of the emerging trends in our global economy is the rise of global virtual teams. Technology has facilitated this, and the COVID pandemic has accelerated the rate of adoption of global virtual teams for many organizations. Harvard professor and author Sidel Neely once wrote that leaders, quote, who actually lead global teams are up against stiff challenges. Creating successful work groups is hard enough when everyone is local and people share the same office space. But when team members come from different countries and functional backgrounds and are working in different locations, communication can rapidly deteriorate, misunderstanding can ensue, and cooperation can degenerate into distrust. As of just a few years ago, fully half of all direct foreign investment dollars from the United States were lost, primarily due to the inability of global leaders to lead successful global teams. This Derwin quote then speaks directly to our discussion of universalism and particularism with respect to the practice of leadership. Western cultures have set the agenda for the teaching of leadership, only to find that Western leaders often struggle mightily to be effective when attempting to apply what they've learned in other cultures. My personal observation is that the Leadership Academy finally is realizing that no longer is it relevant or acceptable to translate a Western leadership textbook and then teach it in non-Western cultures. Let's consider the communication barriers that typically come with global virtual teams. There are many, but we'll simply consider a few of them for now. Physical barriers may prevent an individual from being able to interpret nonverbal cues. This is more common in communication methods relying on technology rather than face-to-face, but other physical barriers include old or broken equipment for communication, uncomfortable temperatures, background noise, poor lighting, large work areas or working in an area that is physically separated from colleagues, even closed doors. Emotional reactions from either or both the speaker and listener also can prevent effective communication. It's difficult to put aside and not act on our emotions, but it is necessary. A common emotion in regard to communication is fear. People often have the tendency to think that their opinions don't matter in the workplace, or that people will judge them negatively if they speak up. This may or may not be the case. The third communication barrier involves semantics and language. There may be differences in language between the speaker and listeners, between leaders and followers. Difficulties in understanding unfamiliar accents, uses of jargon, for example, unfamiliar expressions, abbreviations, slang, colloquialisms, technical terminology, even humor. Humor is often steeped in culture, and many humorous attempts simply do not translate. Other barriers include organizational structures, psychological barriers, status issues, and shortage of time, among others. Here's just one example of a language barrier. Not long ago, I placed an order online for an inexpensive watch that I wanted to purchase. Came from a country outside of the United States. When I received the watch, it was packaged in a very nice package. And you can see that package directly above the watch in this slide. And so whoever the manufacturer of this watch might be, they went to the time, trouble, and expense of creating nice packaging, a nice box in which to ship this watch. I noticed on the edge of the box, as you'll see at the top of the slide, that there was a slogan that was written on that box: "Life is change as time." I have no idea what the manufacturer intended to communicate. In English, that doesn't necessarily translate in a meaningful way. It's just one simple example of a language barrier across cultures. To understand leadership in a different country, a different culture, different region of the world, one should have both knowledge and empathy with the entire local culture. However, the extensive research that Hofstede conducted pointed out that people in different cultures may think, feel, and act very differently from you, from me, even when confronted with similar problems in society. Hofstede and other thought leaders asserted that there is no such thing as a universal management or universal leadership method or approach across the globe. Even the words management and leadership hold different origins and meanings in countries throughout the world. Leadership is not a phenomenon that can be isolated from other processes occurring in society. It interacts with what happens in the family, at school, in politics and government, even religion and beliefs about science. Cultural dimensions, therefore, provide a way for us to consider in general terms some of the major cultural differences that greatly influence how organizations function and how leaders and followers interact. So while these cultural dimensions may seem highly theoretical and even a bit abstract, they are in fact highly practical and carry enormous implications for how someone in one culture is able to lead and even function in a different culture. Here's an example of the contrast of cultural dimensions between 4 countries. You can see that there are many stark differences between these. Another challenge in teaching and learning leadership principles and practices, quite frankly, is the manner in which these concepts are taught. The use of pedagogy remains a common teaching method around the world. For adults, however, there are better ways to learn than through pedagogical approaches that often involve rote memorization or a simple transfer of information. Malcolm Knowles' concept of andragogy is a framework for adult learning that transcends cultures, though I would understand if someone might take issue with that assertion. But Knowles posited that there are specific characteristics that describe the needs of the adult learner. Adults typically need to know the how, what, and why of the subject they're learning. Adults learn best when their learning is self-directed. The prior experience of the adult learner is highly relevant to facilitating learning. Adult learners must be ready to learn, developmentally or at a stage of life where they have the capacity to learn. Adults also learn best when they're solving problems. The context of learning truly matters. Adults learn best also when they are intrinsically motivated to learn, when there is something to be gained from their learning. So we've touched on a few of the barriers to teaching and learning leadership across cultures. Where do we go from here? To lay the groundwork for better understanding how cultural differences often create significant challenges for leaders, the leadership literature points us towards some possibilities. Let's consider 4 aspects of global communication competence, followed by a quick look at a pyramid model of leadership global competency development. Using the global communication competence model developed by Guoming Chen, we can enhance our leadership effectiveness from culture to culture by developing our skills in these 4 areas: fostering a global mindset, unfolding the self, mapping the culture, and aligning the interaction. As a psychological process, a global mindset helps people to broaden and expand their perspective to eliminate the inaccurate stereotypes and prejudices toward people of different cultures. Unfolding the self demands that individuals consistently foster a healthy self-identity for collaboratively building an integrative and holistic future. Mapping the culture refers to the process of acquiring knowledge about our own culture as well as others' cultures in order to gain a deep understanding of cultural similarities and cultural differences. Finally, aligning the interaction requires leaders to continually grow in acquiring cultural intelligence and skills. Doing so enables leaders to function effectively and appropriately in the global communication environment without violating their counterparts' norms and rules. Dr. Joyce Oslin and Dr. Alan Bird developed this pyramid model of leadership global competency development. As you move from bottom to top, you can see the progression of traits and skills that build upon one another in ways that enhance leadership practices. Take a moment to consider this model. Learning how to lead others effectively in the world in which we live will require a fundamental shift in the Western-oriented Leadership Academy's recognition of the need for inclusion across cultures, both broadly and specifically. The social science research necessary to understand the practice of leadership in many countries is and will continue to be challenging. But for the good of all societies, this work must become a priority in order to bridge the many leadership gaps that lead to organizational failures. Once the global leader has worked to develop the necessary skills and traits, then cultural intelligence expert David Livermore tells us that there is an interesting benefit awaiting. And he writes, and I quote, "There's an intentional attempt to develop an alternative culture together and benefit from the fusion that results. Instead of one party converting all of their behaviors to match another, extra efforts are put in to develop something new, a culture where everyone is welcome and the strengths of each are highlighted. Creating something new will always be more work than defaulting to a local or corporate culture. But when done well, it creates an inclusive environment and all members benefit from it." End quote. While I recognize that I've covered a considerable amount of material in these past few minutes, I hope you will engage in further discussion on this topic in our forum. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy the remainder of the conference.